14 fighters are closing in. Over Europe, January 1944. A cluster of B-17 bombers has been pulled loose from the formation, drifting alone beneath a gray ceiling of cloud. No escort, no protective umbrella. Only minutes remain before head-on attacks tear straight through the nose of the formation. Half a world away, June 1943. Over the Southwest Pacific, a lone B-17 reconnaissance aircraft is limping home in the dark, carrying film an entire campaign depends on. Behind it, the same number, 14, climbing fast, converging, preparing to strike. In both skies, the situation looks identical. Outnumbered, exposed, doomed by Doctrine. And in both skies, a pilot does something his crew does not expect. Not luck, not firepower. Position. This is the story of 14 attackers, and the moment a single decision forced them to stop. There is no music when air war begins. Only engines, steady, heavy, mechanical, beating like an artificial heart. At altitude, metal contracts in the cold. The air thins. Every breath must pass through an oxygen mask. Movements slow. Decisions arrive a fraction of a second late. And in that space, a single missed beat is enough for an aircraft to slip out of formation and then out of the sky. World War II in the air did not begin with swirling dogfights and heroic turns. It began with formations, with calculations, with doctrine, and with the belief that if every aircraft held its position, speed, spacing, altitude, then the men inside might survive long enough to finish the mission. By late 1943, that belief was eroding. On both major fronts of World War II, Europe and the Pacific, every power understood the same truth. Modern war could not be won by ground forces alone. Air power opened routes, gathered intelligence, and struck deep behind enemy lines. But the American approach to air war was different. In Europe, the U.S. Army Air Forces placed their faith in a bold doctrine: daylight precision bombing. It was built on confidence. Confidence in technology, confidence in discipline, confidence that tight formations of B-17 flying fortresses could defend themselves with overlapping fields of fire while striking the industrial heart of Nazi Germany. It was a technical belief and a psychological one. Technology would replace cover. Discipline would defeat chaos. Altitude and formation would keep death at arm's length. On paper, it made sense. In the skies over Germany, it did not. The B-17 was designed to survive. Thick skin, multiple engines, multiple gun positions. But it was designed for one specific condition: large formations, mutual support, predictable geometry. War rarely offers that condition. Clouds broke formations. Radio traffic fractured coordination. A single damaged engine slowed one aircraft by seconds, and seconds were enough. Once spacing opened, once geometry distorted, a gap appeared. And in air combat, gaps do not remain empty. German fighter pilots understood this earlier than their opponents. They did not try to destroy entire bomber streams. They aimed to tear them apart, to isolate, to strike the aircraft that no longer fit cleanly inside the pattern. Their most effective method was brutally simple: the head-on attack. Approaching from directly ahead at closing speeds above 500 miles per hour, they reduced exposure to defensive fire and maximized the impact of 20mm cannon. Bomber gunners had seconds, sometimes less, to identify, track, and fire. It was not a duel. It was arithmetic. By late 1943, the numbers were devastating. On some missions, losses exceeded 20%. Entire squadrons vanished over rail yards and valleys. Airfields in England ended the day with empty parking spots and fewer men to count. Quiet questions followed. Was the doctrine flawed? At the same time, half a world away, air war followed a different shape. No endless bomber streams. No layered defensive umbrellas. No comfort of numbers. In the Southwest Pacific, aircraft flew farther, lower, and often alone. Reconnaissance missions stretched hundreds of miles over open ocean and jungle. If an aircraft went down, rescue was unlikely, and the aircraft carried something more valuable than bombs: information, film, images, coordinates, frames that would decide where troops landed, where bombs fell, and where men lived or died. The Japanese understood this. They did not need to destroy American air power. They only needed to destroy the aircraft carrying the cameras. Reconnaissance flights became journeys without retreat, no escort, no backup, no formation to disappear into. Only an aircraft, its crew, and the judgment of the man in the left seat. In both theaters, one truth held. Men were required to operate inside doctrine. Pilots were trained to obey, to hold formation, to avoid isolation, to suppress individual instinct for collective survival. Doctrine did not exist to create heroes. It existed to reduce risk in an environment that could never be controlled. But doctrine had limits. It was written in briefing rooms. War unfolded in clouds, turbulence, and moments where no superior officer could intervene. In Europe, escort pilots were taught to stay outside bomber formations, to intercept threats at a distance, not to enter the bomber stream itself. In the Pacific, bomber crews were taught to fly straight and stable during reconnaissance runs, even under threat, because blurred images meant mission failure. Both assumptions relied on the enemy behaving predictably. The enemy was learning. German pilots learned that American escorts would not place themselves directly in the bomber's path. They exploited that hesitation. Japanese pilots learned that reconnaissance aircraft needed steady flight. They waited for that moment. Each side attacked what the other refused to do, and as long as those assumptions held, the advantage remained, until someone chose to break them. James Howard did not resemble the archetype of the young, reckless fighter pilot. He was older, quieter, analytical. J. Zeamer Jr. did not resemble a textbook bomber commander. He flew lower, farther, and accepted missions others refused, often worrying his superiors. Neither was known for impressive kill counts. Neither fit the mold of the swaggering ace. But both shared one trait. They thought in space, yet not just enemy aircraft, but vectors, angles, approach corridors. They saw not only where the enemy was, but where the enemy needed to be. And more importantly, they saw where no one was standing. Before 14 fighters appear, the sky often feels deceptively calm. Not peaceful, but expectant. Formations stretch, distances widen. Crews below sense movement without seeing it. The men in the aircraft know something is coming. They just do not know when. There is no music, no heroic dialogue, only fuel gauges falling, altitude needles trembling, men doing exactly what they were taught. And then some recognize that what they were taught will not be enough. What follows does not begin with action, it begins with recognition. Recognition that staying the course will end the same way it has before. Recognition that obedience is no longer protection. Recognition that position can matter more than firepower. This realization does not come from recklessness. It comes from experience, from watching patterns repeat, from understanding how the enemy kills. And when the moment arrives, when 14 aircraft begin to close, there is no time to ask permission. There is only time to choose where to be in the sky. There is no alarm that signals a turning point in air combat. No warning light that announces doctrine is about to fail. The turning point arrives quietly. It comes when formations stretch too far to be repaired, when fuel drops below comfortable margins, when the distance between correct procedure and survival begins to collapse into the same space. Over Europe, winter mornings rarely bring full light. Cloud layers hang low. Visibility fractures. Radio channels fill with overlapping calls, clipped and distorted by static. A stream of B-17IS extends farther than planned. Aircraft on the outer edges adjust throttle and trim constantly, fighting to maintain position. A single bomber loses power on one engine, only slightly, but the geometry begins to bend. From above, German fighters see it clearly. They do not rush, they climb higher. They slide parallel to the formation, staying just far enough away to conceal intent. On the ground, this is routine. Luftwaffe pilots have rehearsed this sequence for months. They know when to wait. They know when the bombers will tire. And they know something else. American escorts will not fly directly in front of the bombers. Not from fear, from doctrine. Half a world away, there is no formation to unravel. There is only a single aircraft. A B-17E reconnaissance bomber flies lower than ideal. Not for tactics, but for the cameras bolted into its fuselage. The lenses demand stability. Every abrupt maneuver risks blurring the film. Below, jungle and water. Ahead, the target area. Behind, empty sky that everyone aboard knows will not remain empty for long. When Japanese radar stations and coastal observers detect the aircraft, the response is immediate. Zero squadrons scramble with practice speed. They know the type, they know its speed, and they know it has no escort. No complex orders are required. Take off, climb, close. Both situations are governed by the same force: time. In Europe, every minute escorts remain with the bombers drains fuel they cannot replace. Once gauges reach the return threshold, choice disappears. In the Pacific, every second the aircraft flies straight to capture images gives the enemy more time to climb, coordinate, and select approach angles. Time does not favor aircraft that must remain steady, and inside that delay, the turning point begins to take shape. German fighter doctrine favors head-on attacks for specific reasons. They maximize cannon effectiveness in minimal exposure time. They minimize vulnerability to defensive fire. Everything is calculated in seconds. Japanese Zero pilots rely on coordination. One group draws fire. Another attacks from blind spots. A third prepares the follow-up strike. Nothing in the initial plan allows for improvisation. Everything is designed for speed and certainty, and that design contains a weakness. In a Mustang cockpit over Europe, one escort pilot does not watch the enemy in the usual way. He does not count aircraft. He does not search for a kill. He watches flight paths. He studies the space between attackers and bombers. He recognizes that the entire German tactic depends on one fragile requirement: an unobstructed corridor straight through the bomber formation. In the Pacific, a bomber pilot faces the inverse problem. If he continues flying the planned track, his aircraft becomes the perfect target for repeated attacks. If he maneuvers too early, the mission fails. The film becomes useless. Both men understand they have reached the boundary where obedience becomes organized suicide. No training manual addresses this scenario. There is no diagram explaining what to do when you are the only aircraft between bombers and 14 fighters. No procedure teaches how to use your own position as a barrier. In the Pacific, there is no chapter on forcing a heavy bomber into fighter-like motion while still preserving the stability required for reconnaissance. At moments like these, a pilot stops being part of the system. He becomes the system's fault line. And at a fault line, structures either collapse or adapt. Nothing about the choices forming now is impulsive. They are not born from adrenaline. They are not driven by ego. They emerge from familiarity with failure. The escort pilot has watched too many bombers die to clean frontal passes. He has seen too many formations torn open because no one occupied the space in front of them. The bomber pilot has watched reconnaissance aircraft fall because they followed the safest line drawn on a map. They are not breaking rules to be different. They are breaking rules because the rules no longer protect anyone. Over Europe, German fighters tilt their wings. The signal is unmistakable. They have altitude. They have speed. Distance collapses. Over the Pacific, Zero fighters appear from multiple bearings. They do not rush. They test reactions. They observe whether the bomber will maneuver prematurely. In both skies, those in the cockpits know the window for choice is closing. Seconds from now, the enemy will decide for them. The turning point is not the maneuver. It is the position. In Europe, instead of remaining outside at a safe distance, the escort pilot moves closer, not to attack, but to block. He does not climb above. He does not drop below. He places himself directly in the corridor the enemy requires. In the Pacific, instead of maintaining the predictable straight path, the bomber alters its motion, not to flee, but to disrupt. Both actions violate the enemy's foundational assumptions. And when assumptions collapse, reaction slows. Air combat is ruled by timing. A tenth of a second of doubt can unravel an entire attack run. When the corridor is blocked, when the target no longer behaves as predicted, the attacker must recalculate, and recalculation costs time. Over Europe, a German pilot now faces the risk of collision with an armed escort aircraft at extreme closing speeds. Over the Pacific, a Zero pilot discovers his firing window shrinking as angles shift. Hesitation spreads, not from fear, from mathematics. The most effective attacks are clean, clear approach, stable firing solution, Planned exit. Once that clarity vanishes, attacks grow expensive. More ammunition expended, more fuel burned, more uncertainty introduced. Bomber crews sense the shift. Reconnaissance crews feel the pressure ease slightly. Nothing is said aloud, but something has changed. There is no announcement, no signal of victory, only a quiet realization. 14 attackers are no longer certain they will succeed. In war, that moment is enough to alter momentum. From here on, the contest will not be decided by numbers or strength. It will be decided by endurance. And with that, the battle enters a different phase. Air combat is not as loud as people imagine. Most of it unfolds in absolute concentration. Engines become background noise. Radio chatter turns into static. And the world collapses into a handful of moving points in space. The hell of air combat does not begin when the first round hits. It begins when there is nowhere left to retreat. Over Europe, the moment German fighters commit, calculation gives way to inevitability. Distance closes faster than the human mind can fully process. Aircraft rush toward one another at speeds where recognition precedes meaning. B-17s cannot evade. Formations cannot turn. They can only hold course and endure. In the Pacific, the reconnaissance bomber enters the same zone, but alone. No formation absorbs the initial shock. Every burst of fire is aimed at a single airframe. Distance ceases to be space. It becomes remaining lifespan. The first attack is always the most dangerous. Attackers are fresh. Weapons function perfectly. Confidence is intact. Over Europe, 20-millimeter cannon shells tear through the air, punching toward bomber noses like heated drills. One hit in the forward compartment is often enough to end a crew before they can react. The impacts do not sound like explosions. They sound like hammers striking empty drums. Over the Pacific, Zeros strike from multiple angles. With no formation for shelter, every approach carries lethal potential. Glass shatters, aluminum peels, oxygen lines rupture. Inside the cockpit, the pilot does not see the whole battle. He sees instruments vibrating, pressure dropping, temperature shifting. Hell is not the fear of dying. Hell is knowing you are not dead yet. Documentaries show air combat from the outside. Tracer arcs, banking silhouettes, explosions against cloud. But the decisive space is inside. Inside, everything runs a fraction slower. The brain must filter vibration, hypoxia, and extreme stress. Over Europe, the escort pilot now flies closer than Doctrine ever allowed. Prop wash from bomber engines batters his aircraft, shaking it continuously. Each tremor risks loss of control. Each correction risks collision. In the Pacific, the bomber pilot forces a massive airframe through motions it was never designed to perform. Every aggressive bank is a reminder that structure has limits. Hell here is control inside chaos. Most rounds do not kill instantly. They damage. A frayed control cable, a leaking fuel line, a cylinder losing pressure. Over Europe, a bomber takes hits and stays airborne. This is the most dangerous state. The formation still demands speed and alignment. Every second spent maintaining position pushes the aircraft closer to failure. Over the Pacific, the reconnaissance bomber grows heavier on the controls. Responses lag. Every input requires more force. The pilot feels this not intellectually but physically, through hands and feet. Hell is not being hit. Hell is flying while broken. No pilot is trained for 30 continuous minutes at maximum stress. Adrenaline sharpens reactions early. Then it erodes precision. Vision narrows. Hearing filters. Decisions harden. Over Europe, the escort pilot has remained in danger too long. Each turn burns fuel he cannot spare. Each burst of fire carries cost. Over the Pacific, the bomber crew senses the price of staying. Wounds go untreated. Blood slicks the floor. A wounded gunner remains at his station because no replacement exists. No one says it aloud, but everyone knows if this continues, the ending changes. The second wave is often worse than the first, not because it hits harder, but because fatigue has begun. Over Europe, German fighters return with adjusted angles. They have learned. They probe new weaknesses. Over the Pacific, Zeros experiment with lower, offset approaches. Each variation forces the crew to relearn the fight in seconds. Hell is no longer surprise, it is attrition. Each pass that fails still removes something. Precision, stamina, confidence. Air battles rarely fail due to a single catastrophic mistake. They fail through accumulated small errors. An overcorrection, a delayed response, a glance in the wrong direction. Over Europe, separation between escort and bomber shrinks to margins with no room for error. A stronger turbulence burst could mean collision. Over the Pacific, a violent jolt from a wing strike nearly sends the bomber into an unrecoverable spiral. These moments are not recorded. No photographs exist. Only the pilots know how close they came. At this stage, war ceases to be context. It reduces to one question: can we hold? Over Europe, the escort pilot stops tracking the entire formation. He watches only the most dangerous approach vector. Over the Pacific, the bomber pilot stops thinking about the return flight. He thinks only about keeping the aircraft controllable for the next few seconds. Hell becomes radical simplification. Everything else disappears. Only mission and survival remain. Staying always exacts payment. Fuel slips toward empty. Ammunition dwindles. The body rebels. Over Europe, the fuel needle nears the red. One more minute may erase the possibility of return. Over the Pacific, accumulated damage approaches structural limits. One more failure could end control entirely. The pilots understand this. They are not blind, but they also know that leaving too soon means abandoning others. That choice is hell itself. Firepower kills quickly. Hell stretches the space between life and death. Flying with a punctured wing, holding altitude with an unstable engine, deciding while oxygen deprived. Over Europe, the sky subtly changes. Attacks begin to slow, not from weakness, but from risk reassessment. Over the Pacific, Zeros widen their circles. They have not withdrawn, but they hesitate. One truth becomes clear. Hell has spread to both sides. No aircraft is designed for this. No fighter is meant to act as a shield. No bomber is built for sustained violent maneuver. The only remaining weapon is endurance. Over Europe, every aborted German pass degrades their plan. Over the Pacific, every extended approach burns fuel and opportunity. Endurance begins to matter. Not as victory, but as slow reversal. No one recognizes it immediately. There is no signal, only altered rhythm. Attacks grow less frequent. Intervals lengthen. Commitment fades. Hell does not end with explosion. It ends with the exhaustion of those who are no longer certain they will win. And when that happens, the sky begins to open a narrow exit. There is no victory moment in the sky, no flag raised in the clouds, no line redrawn at altitude. Air battles end differently. They dissolve. Combat does not slow because one side is defeated. It slows because the math of risk changes. Over Europe, German fighters no longer commit with the same certainty. Approach lines become tentative. Dives lose clarity. Each correction costs advantage. Over the Pacific, Zeros widen their orbits. Skill remains. Aggression remains. But every close pass now carries a higher price. When an attack stops producing quick results, it becomes expensive. And in war, expensive actions are abandoned. Withdrawal in the air has no formations and no cover, only direction and altitude. Over Europe, there is no broadcast order. Fighters peel away in pairs, then singly, banking, dropping, disappearing into cloud layers. For bomber crews, this absence becomes the only signal that the storm has passed. Over the Pacific, pressure eases by degrees. Not safety, but space. Enough to check instruments. Enough to assess wounds. Hell does not end with celebration. It ends with unnatural quiet. The most dangerous time comes after the fight. Bodies are depleted. Machines are worn. Focus thins. Over Europe, the escort pilot's final task is not combat, but timing. Stay a minute too long and fuel removes the option to return. Over the Pacific, the damaged bomber must remain controllable. Each vibration threatens to deepen existing failures. Decisions now are no longer tactical. They are pure survival. The return flight is rarely remembered. There is no enemy to confront, no maneuver to describe, only exhaustion as adrenaline fades. Over Europe, surviving bombers limp back in torn formations. Spacing grows. Empty positions remain unfilled. Over the Pacific, the reconnaissance aircraft becomes a problem in aerodynamics. maintain altitude, preserve speed, keep the airframe intact long enough to see a runway. Pilots stop thinking about battle. They think about landing. When wheels touch Earth, war has not ended. It has changed form. Aircraft are parked, holes are counted, cracks are marked. Engineers stare at metal and wonder how it stayed airborne. Pilots step down quietly. No words fit yet. In Europe, reports are brief. Time, direction, contact. Data over emotion. In the Pacific, film canisters are removed before medics arrive. Information outranks narrative. The ground does not care what you endured. It cares what you brought back. When crews speak, accounts diverge. Bomber crews describe hesitation where certainty once existed. Escort pilots describe decisions never taught. In the Pacific, reconnaissance crews speak of holding a line while everything else collapsed. They do not say heroism. They say necessary. The stories differ but converge on one point. An assumption failed. At command level, the question is not bravery. It is why this worked. In Europe, analysts note that placing fighters along the attack corridor increased enemy risk without increasing firepower. Presence altered outcomes. In the Pacific, breaking attack geometry reduced coordination efficiency. Uncertainty replaced precision. The conclusion is the same. The enemy does not fear strength. They fear unpredictability. No immediate directive mandates repetition. The actions are too dangerous to standardize, too dependent on judgment. But thinking shifts. Escorts are encouraged closer. Bombers sense protection can be active, not merely passive. Pacific reconnaissance planning adds geometry, multiple options instead of a single, safe line. These changes enter Doctrine slowly, first through memory. German pilots recognize that head-on runs are no longer clean. Increased escort proximity shortens firing windows and raises collision risk. Japanese pilots observe reconnaissance aircraft behaving differently. Familiar angles lose reliability. Air war is mutual learning. No advantage lasts. But sometimes the pace of learning changes. Medals capture outcomes. They do not capture aftermath. Bodies carry fatigue. Injuries linger. Sleep does not return easily. In the Pacific, deaths follow from wounds endured too long. In Europe, pilots survive and never fly the same again. War does not end when you live. It ends when it stops following you home. This story is not about greatness. It is about people who recognized a problem and refused the existing assumption. Not to break rules, but because the rules no longer match reality. They did not win with superior force. They won with position, by standing where the enemy could not proceed. When the sky grows quiet again, nothing marks what happened. No scorch on the clouds, no line etched in air. Only people carrying memory of a moment when everything might have ended differently. In World War II history, such moments occupy few lines. They do not end wars in a day, but they change how wars are fought afterward. And sometimes that is the most decisive outcome of all.